Enough of that. Right, good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Is that too close to the microphone? Is that all right? Fantastic. So, this is the Star of Bethlehem. What I'm going to be doing is looking very briefly at the Gospel of St. Matthew to remind ourselves what was in there about the account of the Magi and the so-called star in the east. And then I'll be spending a few minutes just thinking about what are the possible astronomical candidates that might have given rise to that account of a star in the east which prompted the Magi to go to Jerusalem to see the new birth of the King of the Jews. So we're going to be looking at how many possibilities there are and thinking about whether the possibilities actually match up reasonably well to the account. And then we'll be having a look at the timeline, asking ourselves, when was Christ born, what was in the sky, and is there a possibility that we can identify what the Star of Bethlehem might actually have been? And then I'm going to use some planetarium software, some freely available software that's available on phones and tablets as well as laptops and computers. And we're going to dial the clock back 2,000 years and look at what was actually in the sky 2,000 years ago to see if any of those candidates actually make sense. And then I'll have a little bit of a summary right at the end. So that's what we're going to do for the next 3 or 4 hours, whatever I've got. It's going to be about 45 minutes or so, not a full hour, this particular talk. Okay, so let's remind ourselves, I am not a biblical scholar, but I did quickly check what was in the gospel to try and get the facts right, as it were, the facts in the sense of the account, according to St. Matthew, that is actually written down in the Bible. So the principal elements that we are trying to deal with are the little bits that are shown in red in the following sentences. So, the Magi traveled to Jerusalem. They were prompted by a, quote, star in the east. So that's the first thing we've got to try and explain, what might have been the star in the east which prompted them to make the journey. One thing to bear in mind is they did not follow the star in the east. A popular misconception, a star in the east appeared and that prompted them to go west. In other words, they didn't follow the star that they saw. When they got to Jerusalem, they asked King Herod, "What's this we hear about the birth of the King of the Jews?" And Herod basically said, well, what are you talking about? So we have to be able to explain why the appearance of a star might have been interpreted as something to do with the birth of the King of the Jews. And if so, why was Herod not aware of what they were talking about? The Magi then traveled on from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, where the star reappeared in the sky and then stopped over Bethlehem. So it might be that we don't find a candidate which ticks all 5 boxes. It would be nice if we can find something which explains each of those 5 elements in red to try and tie it up to the account. But there's no particular reason why a real astronomical event should necessarily tie in with the account in the Gospel according to St. Matthew. But we're going to see what candidates exist and see which ones fit the bill, as it were. So, what we're going to start with is coming back to that carol, We Three Kings. Let's just play the first verse again. Again, enough of that for the time being. So, the famous carol, We Three Kings of Orient Are. Well, actually, the Bible doesn't mention 3. The Bible talks about wise men coming to visit Jesus, and it's always assumed that there were 3 of them. Why? Because it does mention that 3 gifts were brought: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So, if there were 3 gifts, presumably there were 3 people bringing those gifts. But it doesn't say so anywhere. It could have been that there were 20 of them, but 17 just didn't get the memo. You're supposed to bring gifts. So it's just assumed that there were 3. So really, if, like me being a scientist, we want accuracy, we really shouldn't talk about 3 kings. And who says they were kings anyway? The Bible doesn't refer to kings. The Bible refers to magi. The closest translation is wise men. And I understand that from the original Greek, yes, it is a male indication of the noun, so it was wise men rather than wise people. But nowhere does it mention kings, so we ought to take that out of the carol as well. Where did they come from? Did they come from the Orient? Well, depends how you define Orient, I suppose. They came from somewhere west of Jerusalem. It could have been Persia, it could have been India, it could have been Mongolia, it could have been the Far East. Sorry, the Far West. Sorry, the Far East, let's get it right, shall we? Yes, the Far East. So it could have been Persia, it could have been India, it could have been Mongolia, it could have been the very Far East, what we would call the Orient. But really, there's no geographical information in the original account of St. Matthew. So we can't specify that they came from the Orient. They just simply came from, let's get it right this time, somewhere to the east of Jerusalem. So we shouldn't have that in the carol either. And we've just said that they were prompted by a star in the east. They didn't follow the star in the east. The star in the east prompted them that something was happening, and they went west. So they, in a sense, didn't follow yonder star. So you can see this particular Christmas carol is very rapidly starting to fall to pieces. And being a physicist, I like accuracy, so I really ought to replace these things with what we do know. So the Christmas carol really ought to be, we, indeterminate number of men of unspecified geographic origin are, and we saw a star. Now, I know it doesn't meter quite as well, and now you see why physicists don't write Christmas carols. But also we ought to bear in mind that whenever we talk about the three wise men, no mention of three other than gifts. So when we talk about the wise men, we ought to talk about the n wise men, where n is a number between 1 and infinity, because it's plural, so it is definitely more than 1, but we don't know what that number is. It can be anything from 2 up to the population of the Earth at the time. Strictly not infinity, but a big number. So that's something that we have to bear in mind. The other thing we have to bear in mind is that when we talk about the Star of Bethlehem, we don't necessarily mean star in the sense that we mean star today. Today we understand a star is a big ball of hydrogen that is undergoing nuclear fusion and glowing in our night sky, which is not the same as a planet, which is not the same as a comet, which is not the same as the moon, etc. But here we have to remember that the word star is being used in the much more general sense of something visible in the night sky. So in other words, there are certain ways of talking about the stars in the sky. We tend to think of the fixed stars, stars that form patterns in the sky, constellations. They are not unmoving in the sense that as the Earth rotates, the sky appears to move from east to west. Stars rise in the east and set in the west, as seen from the northern horizon when we look south from the northern hemisphere. But we tend to still call those fixed stars because we know their apparent motion is just produced by the rotation of the Earth. So stars that stay fixed relative to each other, we call fixed stars. And there are other things in the sky. For instance, wandering stars was the early expression given to those points of light which look a bit like stars, but they don't seem to be fixed in position like the stars of constellations are. They seem to wander around the sky at different times of year. They can move through the various constellations. So these wandering stars are what we now call planets. But we must agree that when we talk about the Star of Bethlehem could in principle be a wandering star, a planet. We also have hairy stars. Some stars are very pinpoint. Some stars, broom stars or hairy stars, appear to have tails. We now call them comets, and we now understand that they are balls of rock and ice, and some of that ice evaporates as the comet gets close to the sun, and that ice can form a tail pointing away from the sun. But in the early days, these rather odd visitors were simply called hairy stars or broom stars. And you've all heard of the expression, I'm sure, of shooting stars. That's still something that we use today. We're talking about meteors, small particles that are zooming around the solar system. Occasionally they come into the Earth's atmosphere and produce a flash of light. So shooting stars or meteor showers, again, all of these things can be labeled as stars from a particular point of view. And so Here, star doesn't mean star in the sense we mean today. It means essentially anything that was seen in the night sky, perhaps other than the moon, which is normally called the moon rather than a star. Okay, so do we get any sort of clues by looking at, for instance, any paintings of the Adoration of the Magi, which has been painted many, many, many times over the centuries? Now, there's usually 3 visitors, usually 3 kings. We know it's not 3, and we know they're not kings, but that's how they're normally depicted, because that's what people expect to see in a painting, not because it's accurate. And in the background, there's often the Star of Bethlehem shining down, in this case, a star shining down onto the baby Jesus. And that's a common theme. Here, Botticelli, we believe this is Botticelli on the right-hand side, photobombing his own painting, effectively, by looking at the artist. Okay, I just wondered if the laptop or the projector had fallen over, that's fine. Perhaps that's the Star of Bethlehem at the top there, very difficult to tell in this particular rendition. You can see Joseph looking very bored in the background there, not having any part to play in the celebration. Well, perhaps that's appropriate because allegedly he had no part to play in the conception either, so that's probably reasonable. Do we get any other hints from artwork? Well, there's always a star hanging around somewhere in the background, but of course it's very difficult to tell what that actually is. Only Giotto, one of the few people who've painted the Adoration of the Magi, actually showed what is assumed to be the Star of Bethlehem in the background there, not as what appears to be a star or a planet, but what is quite clearly a comet with a tail. Giotto was the only one who actually put a comet in, symbolizing the Star of Bethlehem. That doesn't mean the Star of Bethlehem was a comet, but it's an interesting thing to consider. There are various other depictions of the Adoration of the Magi. In this particular case, we don't seem to have a star at all in the background. In the background, all we seem to have is a 2-headed camel looking in from the distance, trying to work out what's going on. And the same is true of various depictions. Yes, there appears to be a star. It's not a star with a tail. It seems to be a star just shining the radiance down onto the baby Jesus. And the same in this particular last one. There does appear to be a star there. But of course, these things are just artwork. They are not documentary evidence of what the star was. It is an artist's impression of what he expects people to see, what people expect to see in these paintings, and that's what the artists tend to draw or paint. So it doesn't really help to see what's going on. And of course, these paintings are centuries and centuries after the Nativity. So one thing we have to bear in mind when we're looking at or trying to dig up evidence for the Star of Bethlehem is we have to think about the astrological significance. Now, being an astronomer, I have to bite my tongue every time I say astrological, because normally that's a misnomer for astronomical. But here we are talking about the astrological significance of what might be seen in the sky. And generally speaking, regardless of which culture we're talking about, every culture will assign some significance to what's seen in the sky. Every bright star, every wandering star, every planet, and indeed every constellation had some sort of astrological significance. One of the common ones that comes across different cultures is the fact that one of the brightest stars in the sky, the planet Venus, is often associated, because it's so brilliant, because it's so beautiful, the planet Venus is often associated with beauty and fertility and birth. The other bright planet seen in the sky, the other bright wandering star seen in the sky is Jupiter. And because it's seen away from the sun, unlike the inner planets Mercury and Venus, Jupiter can be seen a long way from the sun in the middle of the night. It was often considered to be the best of the planets, the king of the planets. It was considered to be royalty. So Venus associated with beauty and birth, Jupiter associated with royalty and kingship. Regulus is a name of one of the stars in the constellation of Leo. It's the brightest star, and perhaps you can tell from the name, the first 3 letters of the name. It was considered to be the king of stars for reasons I'm not going to go into, but that was considered a royal star in many respects. And Leo itself, the constellation of Leo, is a characteristic asterism of stars, which is often associated with a lion just because it sort of vaguely looks like a lion's shape. And in the land of Judea, the tribe of Judea had a flag with a lion on it. and therefore the constellation that looked a little bit like a lion was often associated with the tribe that used that symbol for their identification of their tribe or their land. So the constellation of Leo was often associated with the tribe of Judea or the land of Judea. So why did people take so much notice of the sky, and why did they assign arguably somewhat arbitrary labels to each of the nature of the constellations and the nature of the planets? Well, it was believed that if you look at the sky, you get an idea of what God has in store for you in the coming days, weeks, months, or possibly years. In other words, is the harvest going to be good this year? Are we going to get a flood? Are we going to have a famine? The sky, if you can read it well, will tell you what's in store. It's just like assuming that basically the sky is God's Facebook page and that's where he posts any message for mankind. Rather than give any other symbolic indication, God will simply rearrange the heavens, move things around to give you a sign that something is about to happen. That's why astrologers were continually reading the sky and advising usually their ruler, who was paying them to look at the sky, telling them what is going to happen in the near future. So let's have a look at what the possible candidates could be for the Star of Bethlehem. We're going to look at the candidates and ask ourselves, does it really meet the criteria of, for instance, being a star in the east? Could it have been considered significant? Is there any reason why Herod wasn't aware of what the Magi were talking about? Could the star reappear in the sky? And could the star stop in the sky? So let's consider for possible candidates whether or not these 5 criteria are met. Could it have been a meteor shower? Could it have been a shooting star? Could the Star of Bethlehem have been a shooting star? Well, meteor showers occur all over the place and at various times of year. Is it possible that a meteor would have been seen in the east? Well, for those of you who've seen shooting stars, you know that they streak essentially all over the sky. So yes, it is possible that one appeared in the east, but why would you say a star appeared in the east if actually stars were appearing all over the sky because we're in the middle of a meteor shower? So that doesn't seem very likely. Would it have been significant to any astrologer? Well, pretty much everybody knew that meteors, even if they didn't know what they were, they knew that meteor showers occurred all the time. There's usually a dozen or so meteor showers every year, and they keep repeating year after year after year. So why would one particular meteor shower in one particular month be considered significant? No particular reason. So that doesn't match. And for the same reason, that's perhaps why Herod wasn't aware of what they were talking about, because there's no reason to assign any particular significance to something that keeps repeating over and over again. Could a meteor shower actually appear more than once in the sky? Could it reappear? Well, as I've said, meteor showers occur various times of year, so there might be a meteor shower in one month, and then the next month, another meteor shower. So yes, the star could reappear in the sky. But what about the idea of the star stopping in the sky? That doesn't seem to make any sense. Meteor showers have lots of flashes of light, usually radiating from a particular point in the sky, but these particular flashes never stop in the sky as such, so that doesn't make sense. So meteor showers don't meet those 5 criteria. Perhaps a couple, but certainly not all 5. What about the possibility of a comet? This is some people's favorite possibility for the Star of Bethlehem. Could a comet appear in the east? Well, yes, comets can sort of appear from anywhere. They come from a large cloud called the Oort cloud, a huge cloud outside what we normally think of as the solar system, and the comets can fall in from this Oort cloud from essentially any direction, and hence they could in principle be seen from the Earth in any direction. So yes, a comet could quite definitely be seen in the east. It's a possibility. Sorry, keep clicking at the wrong point. Could it have been significant? Bright comets are usually considered significant. They're not always harbingers of doom. A bright comet appearing in the sky in most cultures would be significant for there is change coming. Not necessarily change for bad, it could be change for good, but there will be change. So a bright comet would be considered significant. What about Herod wasn't aware? Well, that doesn't seem to work. If a bright comet was seen by the astrologers in wherever they came from, Persia, India, then why wouldn't Herod have also seen said comet? Well, Herod actually had very poor eyesight, but he would have had a court of astrologers, and they would have been looking at the sky. If there was something bright in the sky, they would have seen it, and they would have told Herod. So it doesn't seem appropriate that there was a bright comet visible in the east, but Herod didn't know about it. And what about it reappearing in the sky? Well, comets go around the sun just like all the other planets, and every once in a while a comet might, as seen from Earth, go behind the sun, and so a comet might appear in the sky, and then for a while, perhaps weeks or maybe a month, it might go behind the sun and be essentially invisible for a while until it pops out the other side, and then it might be visible for a while. So it is possible for a comet to reappear in the sky. But the final point, can a star stop in the sky? Well, comets, generally speaking, go round the sun like everything else, and they usually go round at a little bit of a jaunty angle compared to all the planets going round the sun. And as seen from Earth, comets do not seem to just stop in the sky. They usually travel across the sky in a direction which is a little bit unpredictable because it depends on where they come from. But generally speaking, comets do not stop in the sky. So that doesn't seem to fit all the criteria either. What about a nova, a new star? Strictly speaking, not a new star in the sense a new star being born, but a new star being visible. Generally speaking, a nova is a faint star which becomes visible because it brightens quite substantially. Perhaps it gets brighter by a factor of many hundreds or even thousands through a process which we're not going to discuss, but it's an understood astrophysical process. So is it possible that a star in a constellation suddenly got brighter and appeared where there was apparently no star previously? Well, yes, that can indeed happen. Could it happen in the east? Well, a nova is just a star. It could happen anywhere in the sky, so quite definitely it could occur in the east. Would it have been significant? Depends on how bright. If it's just bright enough to be seen, it's unlikely anybody would say this is a really significant event. If it was a very bright nova, perhaps people would have said a new star wasn't there last week. That is definitely telling us something interesting is going to happen. But again, we come back to, well, if the astrologers, if the Magi thought it was significant, how come Herod wasn't aware? Surely his astrologers would have seen it as well. And can it reappear in the sky? Well, a brightening of a star, it can indeed get brighter and then fade away, and it is possible for a star to then brighten again. But normally on timescales of years or decades, or in some cases hundreds of years. It is not very common for a star to brighten, fade away, and then brighten again a few weeks or months later. So nova don't seem to fit the pattern of a star reappearing in the sky. And what about the star stopped in the sky? Well, a nova is just a star like any other, so it would be moving with all of the other stars. Remember, as the Earth rotates, the constellations will appear to drift across the sky. But a nova will be fixed relative to all of those other fixed stars. So if it's not moving relative to the stars, why would you ever describe the star as stopping in the sky? Because it's moving exactly the same way as all the other stars in the sky. So that doesn't seem to fit. Could it have been a supernova, a very bright nova, which is significant because it's a star coming to the end of its life, and it can brighten not by a factor of hundreds or thousands, it can brighten by factors of millions, in some cases billions of times brighter. So it would definitely have to be a lot further away, otherwise we would have got fried by this supernova going off in our vicinity. But perhaps a distant supernova would have gone off. Could it have happened in the east? Absolutely. Would it have been significant? Well, if it was close enough, absolutely, it would have been a very bright light in the sky. But if it was a very bright light in the sky, why wasn't Herod aware of it? Back to square one again. Could it reappear in the sky? Well, a supernova is a star coming to the end of its life and blowing itself to pieces. If it's done that, it doesn't usually happen a second time. Once it's blown itself to pieces, that's pretty much it. So a supernova going off can't reappear in the sky again. And we're back to, again, stars stopping in the sky. A supernova, a star like any other, in a fixed position in the sky relative to the other fixed stars, so it would not be described as stopping in the sky. So 4 candidates which we've trashed because they don't fit all 5 criteria. I've left the 5th candidate till last, and you can tell this is where I'm heading. I think perhaps the Star of Bethlehem might have been a conjunction of planets. And a conjunction is simply planets lining up in the sky, getting very close to each other, which happens from time to time, but there was a conjunction that happened under very particular circumstances. So could an alignment of two planets which are both going around the sun, could they happen to line up in such a way that they were visible in the east? Absolutely. In principle, that can happen in different parts of the sky. Would it have been significant? Well, remember the astrological significance I was talking about earlier depends on which planet in conjunction with which planet and where did it happen in which constellation. So depending on what it is you're talking about, that could have been considered significant. Is it possible Herod was not aware of what they were talking about? Well, Herod might have been aware of the fact that there were two planets in the sky close to each other, or at least his astrologers were, but maybe they didn't apply or think about the same significance to what that particular sign in the heavens actually is indicating. So that's a possibility. Can a star, which is a conjunction of planets, reappear in the sky? Well, planets are going round the sun all the time, and yes, they can be in conjunction at one point in time, and that conjunction can happen again at a later time. So yes, the star can reappear in the sky. And can a conjunction or can planets stop in the sky? Yes, they can, for reasons which I'll show in just a moment. So this idea of conjunctions seems to be a possibility, and depending on how you interpret the facts, it might be that it fits each of the elements of the Gospel according to St. Matthew. Let's just have a few words for those non-astronomers in the audience about conjunctions. So planets go around the sun. Let's just imagine we've got two hypothetical planets, a green one and a red one, and the sun in the middle there. Planets closer to the sun go round the sun faster. So you can see the green planet is going round faster, and every once in a while they seem to be in the same part of the sky as seen from the sun in this particular case. And then at a different time of year they're in a different part of sky, and then again at a particular point in time they might appear to be in the same part of the sky. Bear in mind that planets generally do not line up exactly, because I've shown these orbits of two planets as circular, and I'm assuming they're in the same plane, but actually the orbits of planets are usually tilted a little bit relative to each other, which is why the planets never actually line up exactly. Usually if they get close to each other, they miss each other by maybe a fraction of a degree or even a few degrees. It's much the same argument as the moon goes round the Earth, but the moon doesn't eclipse the sun every month, even though the moon goes round the Earth once a month. That doesn't mean we get an eclipse every month, because sometimes the moon, because of its tilted orbit, goes above the sun, sometimes it goes below the sun. Very rarely does the moon actually go in front of the sun and produce a solar eclipse. Same argument with the planets. And one important point for what's to come is a consequence of the fact that, let me just remind you, those inner planets, because they're closer to the sun, feeling a stronger gravitational pull, the inner planets always go faster than the outer planets. There's a particular consequence of that that's important when we imagine that the green, let's say, is the Earth, and the red is one of the outer planets, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. So what can happen is that Earth can overtake on the inside lane. If we imagine the red planet going from there to there to there, Earth is on the inside track and is going faster. So although the planets seem to wander across the sky because of their motion from west to east, indicated by this little wiggle on the right-hand side, every once in a while the Earth will overtake it, and just like a fast car on the motorway overtaking slower cars, those slower cars will appear to be going backwards to a faster driver. Of course they're all going forwards, but if you're in a fast car, then it can make those slower cars look a little bit like they're going backwards. And that can happen with planets. The planet goes from west to east, but because the Earth overtakes it, the planet stops, goes backwards, stops again, and then goes forward. So it is only, in a sense, an illusion caused by the fact that the Earth is overtaking the planet on the inside track. But in terms of mapping out what does that planet do in the sky, what that planet appears to do is normal west to east motion, and then at some point in its orbit it appears to stop in the sky, and then go backwards, and then stop in the sky, and then go forwards again. So you can see those two stopping points might be something to do with the planet or the star stopping in the sky over Bethlehem. So let's have a look at the timeline. Let's see if any of these facts fit with the timeline of the Nativity. One thing you've got to be very careful about is that there was no year 0. If you go backwards from AD 1, backwards 1 year, you don't get to 0, you go from 1 AD to 1 BC. I'm using the old-fashioned BC and AD rather than before the Common Era, etc. So if you ever use software on your phone or tablet or laptop to look at these conjunctions, for instance, be careful, some software gets it wrong and puts a year 0 in there. And you can see that I've got quite a few years BC because it's thought that Jesus was born sometime BC. And one possibility is that Jesus was born sometime in the period 8 to 4 BC. Again, I'm not going to go through the biblical evidence and why we think that. Another possibility is Jesus was born around 1 or 2 BC. There's a lot of uncertainty because it's very difficult to date things. You very rarely find a writing or a tablet that says this happened 6 BC on a Tuesday or 7th of December on an afternoon. Very rarely do you find a specific date which you can tie in to the Western calendar. At best, you find this event occurred 3 weeks after this eclipse, which occurred the season after the flood, which occurred just before the famine. All events are relative to each other, generally not relative to a fixed calendar, which we can instantly interpret. So there's a lot of uncertainty as to when Jesus was born. And the reason that there are 2 blocks of possible dates is that, again, I am no biblical scholar, so I can't speak to this directly, but I believe some people say that, well, Jesus, according to the account in the Bible, was born before King Herod died. But when did King Herod die? That's not absolutely set in stone either, if you'll excuse the pun. It is possible that King Herod died in 4 BC, in which case it's the left-hand block of grey. But other people think that maybe King Herod died in 1 BC. Why the difference? It depends on if you say that King Herod died after an eclipse of the moon, which eclipse of the moon are you talking about? And maybe people have misinterpreted trying to work out what that date was. So I'm going to assume that Christ was born sometime in that period. So what was in the sky that could possibly have been the Star of Bethlehem? We know that comets were around. Now, comets, yeah, they can be a bit of a problem. They're like cats. They've got tails and they're unpredictable. But they are predictable in the sense that if we've got a chunk of rock and we know how it's moving around the sun, we can wind the clock back and work out where it was at any point in the past. It's easy to work out, relatively easy to work out where it was. It's very difficult to work out how long its tail was, because its tail will depend on how much the sun evaporates the ice in the comet to produce the tail. So we know what was where, but we don't know how spectacular it would have been. But we know that there was a comet around in 12 BC. We know that because that was Halley's Comet. We've seen Halley's Comet multiple times. We know exactly how long it takes Halley's Comet to go around the sun. We can wind the clock backwards and say Halley's Comet was knocking around not far from Earth in 12 BC. But isn't that a little bit early for God to do his posting to Facebook? Why would God put a comet in the sky which signifies the birth of Christ many, many, many years before it actually took place? That doesn't seem very sensible. There were other comets around in 5 BC and 4 BC. The 5 BC comet was called Comet Holmes. For those of you who might be astronomers, you might have seen that. It came past Earth a few years back and people photographed it, but it was not be bright enough to cause a particularly spectacular approach back in a few years BC. The second of those comets, in 4 BC, goes under the wonderful name of Churyumov-Gerasimenko. I have to take a breath before saying that. That's the comet that Rosetta visited. The Rosetta spacecraft went to the comet, took pictures of the comet, and a little lander called Philae was dropped onto the surface of that comet a little while ago. So we have visited that comet, and again, we know exactly how long that takes to go around the sun, and we can calculate that that was around in 4 BC. But that comet is tiny, a little bit like the Holmes comet is not particularly large. Unlike Halley, which is fairly spectacular each time it comes round, these 2 other comets would have been probably completely unspectacular, possibly even invisible. though it's very difficult to tell. So comets don't seem to fit the bill. We said nova, didn't like the idea, but let's accept the fact that it's a possibility. Were there any nova that went off, according to the records, in the sort of period we're talking about during the Nativity? Well, nova don't tend to go off very often in terms of spectacular nova, perhaps visible in binoculars, visible in telescopes, etc., which weren't around at the time, of course. But if it was bright enough to be clearly visible by eye, you don't often get nova that bright. Once every few centuries, you get a really bright nova. Is it likely that two came along at once? The first nova in 5 BC was seen by the Chinese and recorded according to their calendar. And in 4 BC, a nova was seen by the Koreans and recorded in their calendar. And we've tried to translate into our calendar, and it turns out to be 4 BC and 5 BC. But the chances of two bright nova coming along, like buses, you wait for centuries and then two come along in a few months apart, that doesn't seem very likely. So far more likely is that both the Chinese and the Korean records, which are generally very good when you go back to this era, they're probably correct, but we've just dated them incorrectly. So it's probably one nova, and we've just got the dates wrong by a few months. It was in the tail end of 5 BC and the early part of 4 BC, perhaps. So there was a nova, but for the reasons we stated earlier, it doesn't seem likely that a nova going off would have been the Star of Bethlehem. It would have been in a fixed point in the sky. It wouldn't have reappeared in the sky. It wouldn't have stopped over Bethlehem. So let's come to the final bit, which is the what if it could be a conjunction. And sorry for the symbols, but it just keeps it nice and brief. The first symbol there is the symbol for a conjunction, a sort of dumbbell symbol. And the planets are labeled according to their astrological labels, just to keep things nice and brief. So here are the identifications. Jupiter, Saturn, and Venus are the only 3 planets I'm thinking about here. There was a conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn in about 5 BC. And a number of scholars think that that was the Star of Bethlehem. Perhaps you saw the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in December of 2020, a couple of years ago now, where, again, these 2 bright points came close in the sky. And it is possible that that is what people are talking about when people talk about the spectacular conjunction. But I think it's much more interesting to have a quick look at the second one, because there's a conjunction of, again, Jupiter, but this time with Venus. So we're talking about Jupiter and Venus in conjunction around about 2 BC. So, yes, I realize this only works if King Herod died in 1 BC, because if King Herod did die in 4 BC, this will have occurred after the birth of Christ. So this couldn't have been a portent of what was to come. But I think it's interesting enough to have a quick look. So we're just going to use some software to have a look at the sky. So, for those of you who are not astronomers, we are looking at a particular direction of sky. I am not going to show what the night sky looks like as it rotates, as the Earth rotates and the sky moves. I'm not going to show the horizon continually changing, because that gets rather nauseous after a little while. I'm just showing what were the planets doing in the sky in this particular direction of sky. I'm looking in the direction of Leo. There's the Leo, and it's this sort of sickle shape on the right, which makes people think about the mane of a lion. That's why this particular asterism, this particular shape here, gets identified as Leo the lion. There were other zodiacal constellations here, Cancer just to its right, Virgo just to its left. And the line running from sort of bottom left to top right is the plane of the Earth's orbit. That's where most of the planets do their stuff. Most of the solar system is relatively pancake flat, and so the planets go backwards and forwards along this line. I realize you can't read this, so I'll tell you what's going on. We have currently got it set to the 1st of August, 3 BC, at about tea time, roughly speaking. And we're looking to see what's going on. I have not labeled much, because if you try and label everything, it gets so confusing. So the brightest star in Leo is this star here. And I've labeled Jupiter, which you might be able to read and might not. It's just the one with the red flag, okay? I have not labeled Venus, because otherwise the labels do get very complicated. But Venus is just behind it in here. So I'm going to run the clock forward from August, and we're going to watch Jupiter moving from west to east. That's right to left in this particular picture. And Venus, remember, Venus is one of the inner planets compared to Jupiter, one of the outer planets. So Venus is moving faster. So Venus will always catch up Jupiter. So let's look at what happens. There's Venus catching up Jupiter. So on this particular day, the 12th of August, 3 BC, at about tea time, Venus catches up with Jupiter and are relatively close in the sky. What do I mean by relatively close? Well, if you think about the full moon, that's the sort of yardstick we tend to use. The full moon is about a half a degree in the sky. It can be covered easily by your little fingernail. If you hold it up, it sounds odd, but yes, if you hold your little fingernail up to the sky, you can hide the full moon. So these two planets would have come together in the sky and would be closer than the diameter of the full moon. They would still appear as 2 points of light. The very bright Venus and the very bright Jupiter, night by night, would have got closer and closer together, and on this particular day, they would have been just a fraction of a degree apart. And this particular event occurs on this particular day and would have been seen just before sunrise. The sun is actually over here. I'm not showing day and night, and I'm not showing the horizon, but this particular conjunction of Venus and Jupiter would have been seen for about an hour before sunrise. So just as the sky is starting to go blue, these two dots would have been visible, and they would have remained visible for about an hour until the sun rose. So this might have been thought of as a star in the east, a very unusual conjunction of two very bright planets seen in the east. Jupiter, Venus, in the constellation of Leo. Venus signifying birth, Jupiter signifying king, in the constellation of Leo signifying the land of Judea. Venus, Jupiter in Leo, birth, king, Jews. So maybe the astrologers would have said, birth, king, Jews. That's interesting. I wonder why that was. It's worth keeping an eye on the sky now for the next few months, because something interesting might happen. What happens if we run the clock forward? Venus is going faster than Jupiter, so Venus is now going to leg it off the left-hand side of the screen. So there goes Venus off to the left. Jupiter is going slowly, but notice that Jupiter passes very close to the star Regulus. The king of planets has just passed the king of stars. Quite a close pass. And remember that retrograde motion? I forgot to mention that name. When a planet moves backwards, Jupiter stops in the sky and starts to move backwards. It's now moving from west to east. It's very slow to start with. The clock is running at constant speed, but now Jupiter is running backwards, so-called retrograde motion, because the Earth is overtaking it on the inside lane. Jupiter now passes Regulus a second time. We're now into the spring of 2 BC. The king of planets has just passed the king of stars a second time. And now Jupiter stops in the sky again and continues its normal motion from west to east. Jupiter passes Regulus a third time. The king of planets and the king of stars have just done a little dance, and one has passed the other, not once, not twice, but 3 times over the course of a few months. This would definitely pique the interest of the astrologers. And what came next is rather amazing. If we run forward from May to a few more weeks into the future, Venus is back again. Venus goes round the sun quite quickly, and in the time we've been watching this, Venus has been round the sun and is again coming in from the right-hand side. There's Venus and there's Jupiter. So in comes Venus, Venus approaching Jupiter, a very, very, very close conjunction of planets. The previous one, seen last year, the previous year, they would have been a fraction of a degree apart and still visible as 2 points of light in the sky. But now the conjunction is so close, well, I can only convince you how close it is by zooming in on Jupiter. Let's center Jupiter, and now let's zoom in to see how close Venus and Jupiter were in the sky. Let's zoom in and in and in and in and in and in. There's Jupiter. Venus is normally blindingly white because of its atmosphere. This particular planetarium software shows the surface of Venus, which is not very realistic in terms of observing it, only in terms of sending a probe to it. So the disk of Jupiter and the disk of Venus are so close together in terms of their apparent position in the sky that it would have been impossible to resolve them as 2 points of light. When they get that close, the scale of this particular zoom is just an arc minute, less than an arc minute, a tiny, tiny fraction of a degree. much closer than the diameter of the full moon from each other. So close that I don't believe any human would be capable of resolving these two planets as two separate dots in the sky. They would have appeared to the astrologers to have merged into one bright point in the sky. That surely would have been very significant. I found it very difficult to calculate how often this would occur, but I would be surprised if this sort of event occurs more than once per millennium or so. Certainly there's been no record of it since we've had telescopes 400 years ago. So this particular conjunction would have been quite spectacular. So let me just summarize what might have happened. In 3 BC, there was a relatively close conjunction like we saw 2 years ago, and the two planets, Venus and Jupiter, would have come together in Leo, and that might have signified birth of the King of the Jews. And that might have told them, well, we ought to go to the land of Judea and go to Jerusalem and find out what this is all about. Let's just hang on and watch the sky for a while. Over the next few months, the King of Stars passed the King of Planets, or the King of Planets passed the King of Stars, if you prefer, 3 times over the course of the next few months. Maybe this was something about one king handing over the crown to another king. When should we actually go to Jerusalem to actually find out what's going on? Well, later that same year, there was this spectacular conjunction where the two planets would have appeared to merge together in the sky and produce one very bright point of light. Perhaps that was the starting pistol. Some months later, they might have arrived at Bethlehem. How long would it have taken them to get there? No idea. We don't know where they came from, geographically, and we don't know if they walked or they were on camels. If you believe the Christmas cards, they're always on camels, but there's no reason to assume that that is necessarily the case. So it could have taken them a month or two, it could have taken them a long time. Speculation, maybe they got there some months later, where Jupiter is moving through the sky in the way that we can predict, and Jupiter did stop in the sky one more time. So the King of Planets stopped in the sky some months after the starting pistol of Go Now. It's speculation as to whether or not that's the point at which the Magi arrived, but it's interesting to note the date on which the Jupiter stopped in the sky in order to go from the usual west-east to going backwards east-west. The date when it stopped in the sky was December the 25th. But that is an entire coincidence. It just so happens it's the 25th. We all understand that 25th is just the Christian calendar taking out an old pagan festival for the ending of the winter, effectively. So that's just a coincidence that it happens to be the 25th. But perhaps that's a coherent timeline that ties in what we know happened in the sky with what astrologers might have interpreted at the time. So maybe it was conjunctions of Venus and Jupiter in the constellation of Leo that ties in with the Gospel of St. Matthew, or perhaps inspired the Gospel. The Gospel, remember, was written a long time after the Nativity, so maybe the events of the conjunctions were handed down as a story and found their way into the Gospel at some point later. Maybe not. Maybe it was something else. Maybe it was a different astronomical event. Some people are convinced it was definitely a comet rather than a conjunction of planets. Maybe it was a combination of events. Maybe the story has got a little bit distorted over the millennia or over the centuries between the Nativity and the Gospels. Maybe lots of things happened within a few months and the story has got a little bit mangled. Determining the facts is easy. We know exactly where the planets are. We can tell exactly where Jupiter and Venus were 2,000 years ago. That is not difficult. But second-guessing the significance that an astrologer would apply to these planets in the sky, that's altogether more tricky and is entirely speculation. Regardless, the message, of course, is still the same. Hope you all have a good Christmas. Thank you very much.